Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Dalia. Gebrial, Dalia, how are you doing?
Hi, it's been a while. I've been up to so much, and I have explanations as to why I've been away for so long, which will be apparent in the coming weeks. But I've missed this. I've missed us.
I like that apparent in the coming weeks. Does that mean there's a sort of surprise that we can look forward to?
I guess so.
Standing for Parliament? I mean, it wouldn't be the right time, would it?
God forbid.
Coming up tonight, millions of Americans are fleeing Florida ahead of Hurricane Milton. Israel ramps up its forced evacuation of Northern Gaza, and a shock result in the Tory leadership contest. There's been an upset in the race to be the next Tory leader. Yesterday, this was how support for the final three candidates looked. James Cleverly had won the support of 39 MPs. Robert Jenrick had 31 and Badenoch had 30. Aaron and I discussed this on last night's show, and we assumed that the final two would be either Cleverly and Jenrick or Cleverly and Badenoch. That's also pretty much what everyone else had assumed. But these were the results today. Kemi Badenoch is on 42, up 12 from yesterday. Robert Jenrick on 41, up 10 from yesterday. And James Cleverly is down 2 on 37, meaning it's Cleverly who's been knocked out. So how did the former favourite lose support between yesterday's knockout round and today's? Bloomberg's Alex Wickham tweeted this. Tories saying they think the Cleverly camp lent Jenrick votes to try to keep Badenoch off the ballot, but lent too many. Or Cleverly supporters did it off their own backs, thinking he was nailed on for the finals. Maybe they got a bit too complacent. It's a massive blow for James Cleverly, of course. It could also be a blow for the Conservatives. It was James Cleverly who the public thought was far and away the most likely to become the next Prime Minister. He was on 21% with Jenrick and Badenoch on 10% and 7% respectively. So, of course, none of them actually being the most popular. But of the candidates on offer, it was James Cleverly who people thought seemed the most plausible to enter Downing Street. With Cleverly out, Tory members now have two right-wingers to choose from. And one big dividing line between Badenoch and Jenrick will be membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. Jenrick wants to leave it, Badenoch doesn't. And she explained to the media her position on this afternoon.
And what I talked about in my conference speech and when I launched my campaign was that we need to talk about everything. We need to talk about the system, which I think is broken. I think Labour are having problems because they're working with a broken system. And we need to adapt. We need to change our economy. Let's get some more money so that we can spend it on defence. Let's get more people out to work. Let's talk about the NHS. It can't just be about one little part of immigration policy. We need to lower immigration. That is part of the story. But just talking about the ECHR is going to shut down the conversation that we need to have with the entire country. And that's what I'm about.
To get a sense of where the Tory leadership race will now go, I spoke earlier to Conservative commentator Albi Amankona. I asked him to begin with whether what we witnessed this afternoon was an almighty cock-up by James Cleverly.
I think it's certainly a surprise. Most pundits, whether or not they were just bog standard mainstream political pundits or Tory pundits like myself, after James Cleverly came first in the leadership ballot yesterday with 39 votes, I think everyone pretty much had it nailed on that they thought James Cleverly would be in the final two. What actually happened, of course, as you know, Michael, is that James Cleverly went from 39 to 37 votes. They went backwards by 2. Kemi Badenoch blasted out into the front and she ended up with 42 votes of Tory MPs and Robert Jenrick on 41. So there's lots of conversations. Some people are saying that James Cleverly's team lent Robert Jenrick votes and he didn't calculate the maths properly, and so James Cleverly has fallen out of the competition. Other people are saying, no, that's not the case. James's team was saying, vote for whoever you like, vote with your heart. But all that we do know is that the people going to the Conservative Party members are Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch.
Talk to us about the difference between the two, because I think, everyone had it in their head that one of the last two would be Cleverly, and we thought this would be a bit of a contest between the party's centre and the party's right, whether or not he was up against Jenrick or Badenoch. Now it's Robert Jenrick versus Kemi Badenoch. It looks a bit like the right versus the right. These are both people on the right of the party. What will the contest look like?
First of all, I don't recognise the description of James Cleverly somehow being a candidate of the centre of the party, being a One Nation Conservative or anything like that. He's never identified as that. This is someone who was a Brexiteer before it was fashionable. This is someone who was a key Boris Johnson ally right until the end. This is someone who backed Liz Truss to be the Prime Minister and became Foreign Secretary under Liz Truss. This is someone who pledged to cut taxes in his leadership campaign. He was going to scrap stamp duty. He was talking about raising defence spending. So I've never really been comfortable with this description of James Cleverly as someone from the centre or the centre-left of the Conservative Party. I don't think that is accurate. But in terms of the differences between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, I think there are some pretty stark differences, actually, and not just visual differences, which I think are obvious. The main difference for me is their position on things like immigration, things like on the ECHR, things like policy in general. Robert Jenrick has been very prescriptive and very specific on the specific policies that he wants to see. He wants to increase defence spending to 3%, and he wants to get to that 3% of GDP on defence spending by cutting the international aid budget. He wants to withdraw from the ECHR, of course, the European Court of Human Rights, and implement a British Bill of Rights. He wants a legally binding cap on immigration in the tens of thousands, I think it is. He's been very, very specific on policy. Whereas Kemi has been less specific on policy and is very much talking about going back to first principles. Her campaign is called Renewal 2030. So that's actually, she's talking about a renewal after the next general election takes place, probably in 2029. It's much more going back to first principles, going back to basics. What is conservatism? What do we believe in? I want a smaller state, but what does that actually mean? And that, you could argue, led to that quite embarrassing gaffe that we saw at conference, where she was trying to express that point of view. And she ended up saying things like, or sounding like she was saying things like, I think maternity pay is excessive. Businesses can't afford to pay minimum wage, which, of course, a lot of people listening or watching us today will think those are odd comments. But that's because she's trying to really get back to first principles and figure out what conservatism is for the 21st century, whereas Robert has lots of policies ready to go.
I mean, you mentioned gaffes. Obviously, the maternity pay one was probably the biggest one. Kemi Badenoch started this contest as the favourite. Then she sort of quite dramatically tumbled, basically because I think, she'd made a few gaffes and people thought she doesn't actually seem particularly competent. Now it seems as if, perhaps by some sort of accident, she's slipped through into the final two and she is once again the favourite. Is there a concern among Conservative Party members like yourselves that you're sort of in danger of electing someone who doesn't seem necessarily up to the job?
I don't think that's right at all. Kemi Badenoch has been consistently the number two person from the outset until the final ballot, where she became the number one person. So I don't think you could say she had some sort of faltering campaign. Yes, there were gaffes at the Conservative Party conference. They were reported on in the media quite extensively. But I think the reaction within the Conservative Party to those gaffes and the reaction in the media and therefore the general public were actually quite different. Yes, people at conference were talking about how odd those comments were, but she's got a lot of support within the party. And there would have been some people in the party who probably didn't necessarily disagree with what she was saying, people that want to strip things right back and start thinking about things from first principles, which is what Kemi is talking about. The trouble for the candidates now is that now they're both in the final two. I think the Conservative Party members will be thinking a lot more about a candidate who can appeal not just to the Conservative Party faithful like myself, but actually to the country. And I don't think the Conservative Party people who are in the final two can afford any more kind of freaky things like talking about maternity pay being excessive, wearing a Hamas terrorists, whatever that was, a jumper, even though they are a prescribed group. So that is a factually accurate statement. People just think those are odd things to do. These aren't really things that are top of mind for the British people. And I think Conservative Party members will be interested in what the final two have to say on the people's priorities.
No, I suppose you potentially, to some degree, maybe overestimating the Tory membership, because what you seem to be telling me is that they're going to be really looking for which of these potential leaders is going to be able to best sort of appeal to the wider electorate. Whereas this is, of course, the party that elected Liz Truss quite recently. So, I mean, do you really think that they're going to be sort of saying which of these candidates is a winner, not which of these candidates most flatters my own political persuasions or prejudices, depending on how you're looking at it?
Well, look, both candidates are supposedly from similar wings of the party. So that whole kind of, is this candidate right-wing enough, or is this candidate too kind of liberal on the liberal wing of the Conservative Party? That dichotomy doesn't exist, because both of these candidates are over the right, so to speak. So actually, I think that gives a lot more space for Conservative Party members to think about the other things which are important in a leader, not how right-wing they are, how tough they are on immigration, how much tax they want to cut. I don't necessarily think those things will be key things in this leadership election, like we saw in the last leadership election, because a lot of things have changed since then. We have lost an election. We're now a much smaller party in Parliament. We want to win an election. And I think Conservative Party members will be wanting to try at least to pick a winner. The question is, Michael, is whether or not we are in our IDS Michael Howard phase, or whether or not we're in our David Davis, David Cameron phase. I think the jury's out on whether or not these are IDS and Michael Howard, or whether or not they're David Davis and David Cameron, of course, who took the Conservatives to a win in 2010. Let's see what happens in 2029.
That was Albi Amankona speaking to me earlier today. I have to say, just from a purely journalistic perspective, I think these two going through to the final round is much more interesting than if it had been James Cleverly. Both really ideological people, would both be, difficult to predict how it would go were they leader of the opposition. I think James Cleverly would have been much more likely to play it safe. As we've talked about, Kemi Badenoch, very gaffe-prone. Robert Jenrick, very, very ideological. He is going to be really, really, if he were to win, trying to get those reform voters, which could, put pressure on Keir Starmer. I think it could, it can seem naff to focus on identity issues, but I think it could be challenging for Keir Starmer, this awkward old white guy, to be trying to attack Kemi Badenoch as a younger black woman. But we'll see. Obviously, she's not the ideal candidate, as we have seen throughout this contest. The International Rescue Committee has warned that as many as 51,000 children in Gaza could be unaccompanied or separated from their parents or caregivers. In a new report, the IRC says that based on past experience of other crises, it believes the number may be 3 times higher than the official estimate of 17,000. Here's a quote from that report. IRC research has found that the risk of family separation has increased dramatically in the past months, exacerbated by multiple rounds of displacements, arrests, Israeli evacuation orders, and fatalities, with some children found living alone in hospitals. Even before the latest escalation, at least 500,000 children in Gaza needed mental health and psychosocial support. Now the burden of witnessing profoundly distressing events, multiple displacements, and lack of safety means that every child, parent, and caregiver in Gaza is experiencing trauma, which could require long-term mental health and psychosocial support. Meanwhile, UNRWA says at least 400,000 people are currently trapped in northern Gaza after Israel declared it a closed zone. It ordered the entire population to move southwards to the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. Al-Mawasi is already extremely overcrowded, and it's been suggested by some that it's more accurately described as a concentration camp. Those trapped in northern Gaza are at constant risk of Israeli bombing. In the Al-Rafi school in the Gebrial refugee camp, displaced Palestinians have sought refuge. but a strike there has killed 3 people and left at least 15 others injured, including children. UNRWA says at least 7 UN-run schools sheltering displaced people are being evacuated, and that Israel attacks have forced the agency to shut down life-saving services. Local sources say that the intensity of bombing in the north of Gaza is similar to in the early stages of the war. Attempting to leave the north is not without its risks, though. Palestinians attempting to comply with IDF orders and who are fleeing south say they're being shot at by quadcopter drones as they try to move. CNN has reviewed footage which appears to show residents of Gebrial refugee camp fleeing under fire. The network says drones can be heard buzzing in the background as the bullwhip-like sound of bullets piercing the air triggers screams and attempts to shelter. CNN interviewed the man who filmed the footage they saw, and he said this: drones were firing at everyone passing by on the road. 3 people were shot right in front of me. My brother and I tried to help the injured to get to the hospitals, but a little girl was shot in the neck and her father was also injured. CNN didn't show the footage, neither are we. I mean, for us, it's also because YouTube would probably take it down, but on Twitter, you can see some really, really horrifying footage, actually, of a young girl who's been shot in the neck. The Israeli army has also ordered the complete evacuation of patients and staff at 3 hospitals in the north of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Health Ministry says Israel has demanded the evacuation of Kamal Adwan Hospital, the Indonesian hospital, and Al Auda Hospital with 24 hours notice, and has threatened destruction, killing, and arrest if they do not evacuate. Gaza health officials have pleaded for, quote, serious protection for health institutions and their staff, especially in the northern Gaza Strip. ActionAid released an urgent statement on the forced evacuation of hospitals in northern Gaza. They say this impacts all patients, medical staff, critically ill individuals in intensive care, pregnant women, and newborns in incubators. The Al Auda Hospital, one of ActionAid's valued partners, is a vital healthcare facility serving the most vulnerable in Gaza and one of the only remaining hospitals providing maternity services across the Strip. Forcing its evacuation under such perilous conditions is not only unconscionable, but also a violation of international humanitarian law. At the same press conference, it was reported that Kamal Adwan Hospital is currently under siege, with certain buildings under fire. One paramedic was even detained while accompanying an evacuated patient despite coordination efforts. These incidents mark a dangerous escalation and place further lives at risk. Sort of odd reading these statements today, because it's exactly the kind of statement we were reading almost a year ago. So, of course, on Monday's show, we were talking about a year from October the 7th. And it does seem like in northern Gaza, at least, we've gone full circle. So there was that period in the first couple of months of the war where it was the most intense. So it's been horrific. It's been genocidal for the whole period since October the 7th. But it was those first 3 months where you saw the most people die in the shortest amount of time. It was when they were most aggressively bombing whole families. And then we had this sort of news cycle where it was various hospitals being put under siege, hospitals being evacuated, babies being left in incubators. And once again, that seems to be happening again. Obviously, this time around, it gets less media attention because people have seen it all before. But as far as I understand, what's happening here is that the Israelis are trying once again to evacuate northern Gaza, just like they did a year ago, and I suppose have a second shot at destroying parts of Hamas, or trying to create some kind of buffer zone in northern Gaza, which seems fairly likely now. It does seem like they're trying to create a buffer zone in northern Gaza and a buffer zone in Lebanon. And by buffer zone, that means you've done some ethnic cleansing there, essentially. The UN says a full quarter of Lebanese territory is now under IDF evacuation orders, with displaced people living on the streets and beaches of Beirut. At least 4 people have been killed and 10 injured in an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon. Lebanon's national news agency says the strike hit a hotel housing displaced families. A video posted online also shows uniformed IDF soldiers planting an Israeli flag in the southern Lebanese town of Maroun el Ras. Asked for comment, US State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said this was obviously inappropriate. That's about as strong as words from the Americans ever get. God forbid they ever stopped sending this country weapons. On the Israeli side, 2 people were killed during a rocket attack in a town on the border with Lebanon. Hezbollah has said it fired rockets at the area. Hezbollah also announced that it ambushed Israeli troops with an improvised explosive device as they attempted to move toward the town of Blina at the east of the Israel-Lebanon border. Separately, the armed group says it pushed back an Israeli platoon trying to enter the Labuna area close to the coast in western Lebanon. Additionally, at least 6 people were injured, 2 critically, in a stabbing attack in the Israeli city of Hadera. Dalia, I want to go to you on this. It seems like there are sort of 2 big stories going on at the moment, obviously, as well as how Israel is going to respond to Iran. But you've got a situation in Lebanon where it seems as if Netanyahu has basically threatened to turn Lebanon into Gaza unless people somehow magically remove Hezbollah. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely implausible, but he's basically threatening to turn it into Gaza. Meanwhile, Gaza is sort of going into this sort of full circle phase whereby Israel seems to be once again moving from the north down south in a sort of second attempt to, I suppose, claim it's getting rid of Hamas, but basically just constantly kick people out of their homes while bombing civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, and those words by Netanyahu are all but an admission that this was always about an act of not just collective punishment, but annihilation. I mean, the kind of objectives that he outlines there of southern Lebanon, freeing itself from Hezbollah is like not a coherent or relevant or meaningful statement. It's just a kind of, it's meaningless. But I think we have to really look at the big picture of why Israel would continue to pursue this seemingly endless war, genocide, without any clear objective or without any clear end game or without any kind of coherence. And why is it trying to expand this war beyond the boundaries of Palestine? And for me, whenever I'm thinking about this, I think about a quote from Thomas Jefferson, which he is attributed to him from 1820, so 40 years before the abolition of slavery. And on talking about whether or not slavery should be abolished, Thomas Jefferson said, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. And that is the exact calculation that the US, that our government, that every government that is enabling and facilitating this endless and aimless destruction, not just in Palestine, but across the region, that is the calculation that they are making, because ultimately they know that there is no turning back. And they know, much like the slave owners of the American South, they have made this calculation and have this belief that in order for them to retain the kind of normalcy that they desire, or to go back or forwards to a kind of normalcy that they envision for themselves, that they have gone so far for so long that that kind of normalcy that they envision for themselves is not possible without maintaining people that they have oppressed in permanent servitude and practically almost extinction indefinitely. And that is essentially, what the end game is, because this kind of maniacal destruction in the region is because at this point, there is no way back. There is no return to the kind of soft power and reputational status and buy-in amongst regular people that Israel had for a short period of historical time. That's gone. The Israeli government and its allies know that they have subjected not just the Palestinians, not just the Lebanese, but every thinking, feeling person of conscience in the world to images and death tolls that they simply will never forget. And so for them, there is no end game without the total annihilation of everyone that can hold that memory. But unfortunately for the Israeli government, much like those slave owners of the American South, you can't hold a wolf by its ears forever. And Palestine, the idea of Palestine, what Palestine represents, is not just in the West Bank. It's not just in Gaza. It's not just in Lebanon. It's not just in these parts of the world that Israel feels like it can have a military might over and can wantonly destroy. Palestine is everywhere. It's in the US. It's in the UK, it's across Europe, it's in Latin America, it's in the hearts and minds of every person of conscience in this world. And Israel can't eliminate every person of conscience in the world. And so that is why, and this is where it's incredibly scary, because there is no end game other than an attempt to annihilate all trace or all possible resistance of what might happen in the wake of this destruction, which itself is impossible. And so the question is, they're going to keep going until someone stops them. And we've spoken a lot about how, it's our governments, it's the US, it's Europe, it's Britain that continues to be an active facilitator of this genocide. But it is precisely because they know that the minute that this wanton violence ends and we return to a moment where we're not in this active war, the face of Israel in the world that it relies on so heavily has changed forever, because Israel has shown itself, has shown what it is capable of, has shown the logic that it wants to expand way beyond any kind of borders that have been agreed upon in international law. And ultimately, I think that this is where we are in this kind of moment of this violence and this destruction and this collective punishment and this desire to pummel as hard as possible because we're scared of what might happen when people have freedom. But that bargain has rarely won historically, and it's unfortunately for Israel not going to win for them either.
I mean, this is the really grim thing, right? It has won historically where a country has done the genocide. Obviously, the Nazis got defeated, but if you're looking at sort of other settler colony states, the example is to say, oh, you did the horrible thing, but then the people were gone, and then you can kind of forget about it, and maybe you have a sort of Memorial Day every year. And I do seriously think that there probably are many people in Israel sort of thinking along those lines, which is to say, look, we've taken the reputational hit already. Everyone that was going to hate us already hates us. We might as well achieve something, which is getting rid of the Palestinian problem forever. And that logic would. That's a genocidal logic, right? And I think it does seem that is what we're seeing, which is incredibly worrying. You can see why, as sort of a right-wing Israeli who's completely dehumanized Palestinians and who sort of wants a greater Israel for sort of incredibly ideological reasons and wants total security and sort of thinks, the United States got to do a genocide, why can't we? You can see why they want to go along with that. Why, however evil it is, why sort of, the Labour Party, does Keir Starmer really want to be associated with that? When the journalists haven't been in Gaza for a year, we don't have good information about what's going in there. There is going to be a moment after this ends when journalists go in there, when they actually count up how many people have been killed, and there is going to be a bit of a reckoning. Joe Biden's going to be dead probably, right? Kamala Harris doesn't, seem to really know what's going on. Does Keir Starmer really want to have what's happening right now associated with him? And I think there are probably lots of international leaders who will sort of, should be worried about that. Dalia, I suppose you've said, the idea of Palestine will live, and 2 million people in Gaza still exist, right? It's not like this is not a story that's ended. But do you have an idea of what can happen now? Are we just going to see the last 12 months again? It feels a bit like that, doesn't it? That we'll just see what happened over the last 12 months again.
I think that is Israel's goal. And what I would say, I think you are totally right to say that historically, these white supremacist projects have succeeded in many ways. And I think, I'm sure that Israelis are looking at the US and saying, well, you guys did your, genocidal elimination of the indigenous population, and you went on to be an empire, and thinking, who are you to tell us that we can't do that ourselves? Unfortunately, as grim as that is probably the most truthful thing that the Israeli government that has come out of, the Israeli state. I think Netanyahu said, oh yeah, we've killed 40,000, but that's way less than you guys killed in, Iraq. Broken clock is right twice a day. But I think that when you look at a country like the US, it is always underpinned by that fundamental contradiction. And even though like there's this thing of like, you feel like a settler colony or a nation, like an empire can kind of keep a lid on it for what feels like decades and what feels like centuries. But ultimately, if you look in the US context, that contradiction of the settler colony, the contradiction of the suppression of indigenous people, of the enslavement of Black Americans, that contradiction does continue to plague the social fabric of the US. And so I don't think that the kind of, unless they do achieve literal total annihilation, I don't feel like they will be able to achieve the kind of normalcy that they think they want to achieve. But they are going to get as close as they possibly can, because that is ultimately the end goal. But what we have, which is not quite the same as what, when it comes to the indigenous genocide in the US, is we live now in a globally networked world where what happens here and what happens in the US and what happens in Europe, Israel, unlike the US, is heavily reliant on these global networks. And so there's a diffusion of that possible counterpower and that possible leverage that both makes this of power really difficult to untie, and yet makes it possible to untie from other locations. We can look at South Africa, for example, in that it was pressure from, Cuba, it was pressure from boycotts in Europe and America. It was this kind of, the global network within which these states exist does mean that there are pressure points that we can apply. And I think that's why I find the holding a wolf by its ears metaphor like really indicative, because there is this sense that like at some point you're going to have to let the wolf go, and at some point we're going to have to look in the destruction, and at some point we're going to have to like reckon with the fact that the indigenous people of Palestine are not all just in Palestine, they're all over the world, and that memory is and that political philosophy, that political understanding is diffused around the world. And so it's actually in a much more nebulous moment now than perhaps it was, 200, 300 years ago, 400 years ago.
So, I mean, norms have changed between, 200, 300 years ago and now. So, I mean, I know lots of people sort of look at what's going on here and say, well, all of, Western civilization was all based on a lie. And I mean, in many ways, this is proving that point. But it definitely, there has been some sort of progress in terms of what people find acceptable. And, thank God, the genocide of indigenous people is seen as less acceptable now than it was 300 years ago. And I think the Israelis seem a little bit annoyed about that. They're like, well, maybe we should rethink this whole sort of moral disgust that we've developed when it comes to killing lots of people because we want their land. Millions of Americans in Florida are currently evacuating from their homes ahead of a massive hurricane hitting the region. More than 6 million people have been ordered to leave their homes as the state prepares for Hurricane Milton, due to reach Florida on Wednesday evening. On Tuesday, hurricane speeds reached Category 5 status as the storm moved across the Gulf of Mexico. It was today downgraded to a Category 4 hurricane. The extreme weather event comes just 2 weeks after another hurricane, Helene, hit the same region. And this NBC report explained why that's such a problem.
Streets in Longboat Key, completely empty. All that is left are piles and piles of sand and debris waiting to be picked up before Milton arrives. And take a look at this. Thousands of cots line Tropicana Field, the home of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, transformed into a massive shelter for first responders. Residents rushing to grab groceries, clearing out stores, and even gas pumps. We're told more than 15% of gas stations in the state are without fuel. One of the biggest concerns tonight remains the massive debris piles left from Hurricane Helene. Crews working around the clock to clear loads of trash before Milton hits, and those destructive winds turn the debris into missiles. And this just in, a county official in charge of the debris cleanup tells me most of those piles we see around the Tampa area will not be picked up.
So if you're looking for apocalyptic visions of a future of extreme weather, you've got a situation where you've got a big problem because the hurricanes come, and obviously you want sort of heavy, large objects to be out of the way when it arrives, because they're going to end up being missiles sort of flown around by the hurricane. And Florida is still covered in all of this debris from the hurricane they had 2 weeks ago. Right, so this seems like the kind of problem you don't want to have. In terms of precisely how the impact of a hurricane develops, I found this report from CNN useful.
So when it does get to Florida, it's going to impact a larger area. So still likely a Category 3 making landfall, losing some steam here for a while as it makes its way. And probably somewhere around 35, 36 hours from now is when this thing actually makes landfall. And people ask all day, where's it going to hit? It's going to hit everywhere. Look at this is the size of the Category 3 or higher wind speeds, all the way from well north of Tampa, all the way south of Fort Myers. And then the rest of the state gets hurricane force. There's your hurricane force ball all the way across to the east side. So Daytona, Orlando, you're all going to see power outages. You're all going to see wind gusts likely between 90 and 100 miles per hour. But then the surge, this is what all the mayors are talking about. Get away from this surge. The surge from Helene was 6 feet, 7 feet. This is going to be 15. So if you got wet at all in Helene, you're going to get overtopped in this storm. And then it's going to rain. And there are going to be places across the Florida Peninsula that could get 10 inches of rainfall and make flash flooding when it comes to the rain event, the freshwater flooding, not the saltwater flooding.
So that's the phases. You get sort of this really sort of speedy wind, which is going to batter down your house. Then you get this wall of seawater, and then you get the heavy rain. So those are the sort of three phases that I thought that report brought out quite usefully. Warning residents to evacuate. The mayor of Tampa has been very clear that people need to leave. And she said this yesterday as to what would happen to people who stay.
This is literally catastrophic. And I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die.
Wow. I mean, that is an incredibly blunt message. And I know you have a lot of experience dealing with these storms. You don't say something like that lightly, Mayor.
I've never said that. And 10 to 12 foot surge. I mean, if this takes a jog to the south, that's going to save us from the storm surge. But it stays on the track that it's projected to be on right now. Or if it goes a bit north, would be even worse. Some of the predictions are saying that Pinellas County, to the south of us, the entire county is going to be underwater. So this is something that I have never seen in my life.
Now, if that message from the mayor wasn't scary enough for residents, two terrifying CGI animations from the Weather Channel have been going viral. This animation shows what different categories of hurricane mean in terms of wind strength.
In a Category 3, you can have the door of the house blown in because the winds get so strong. You can have the roof of the house start to flap up and down in the wind because it can lift off those weak points, and a lot of those trees start to fall. Category 4, the damage is even worse. You get most trees falling, most of your windows breaking, most of your shingles fly away, and then Cat 5 is as high as the category scale goes. By Cat 5, no shingles remain anywhere nearby. The holes in the roof get so big that the walls of the house start to fall because they're not attached to anything anymore. There won't be any trees up in the neighborhood. That's just catastrophic damage.
A second viral Weather Channel animation explains the effect of different levels of flood.
Imagine this. Imagine 3 feet of storm surge right here. Now, if this amount of water catches you by surprise, it's too late to evacuate. Cars are floating around and floating away. There's large objects in here that could knock things down with a battering ram-like force. Now, there's no way, again, to evacuate with this kind of storm surge. But we know there's going to be places with more than 3 feet. Imagine 6 feet of storm surge. Now, this completely floods out the first floors of homes and businesses, and the only way to escape that is to move to the higher floor of a building. Now, unfortunately, there are going to be places that get more than 6 feet of storm surge flooding. Imagine this, 9 feet and even beyond of flooding, of inundation. This is practically not survivable. So please follow the advice of your local officials when they ask you to evacuate.
So I said those were going viral. They're actually from previous storms. And what's really notable here is that terrifying final clip you saw there from storm surges. He was showing you what would happen with a storm surge up to 9 feet. And as you saw before from the weather report earlier, it's expected that the storm surge could be up to 15 feet in this instance. So if you thought that CGI sort of video was scary, it could be worse than what he was suggesting there, because that was a previous storm. This is a weather event where climate scientists can be pretty certain its intensity is caused by climate change. The warmer the sea is, the stronger a hurricane is likely to be. And this year, the ocean heat in the Gulf of Mexico is higher than ever. To find out more, I'm joined now by climate scientist Ella Gilbert. Thank you so much for joining us. To begin, how unusual is Hurricane Milton?
Well, Hurricane Milton is pretty off the charts in lots of ways. For one thing, it intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in about 18 hours. So hurricanes intensify really fast. The pressure in the middle drops, and that's what brings those really, really high wind speeds and destructive action. But this one was intensifying like an insanely rapid rate. So this one is particularly unusual, as well as the circumstances and the fact that the ocean is super warm at the moment. It all kind of combines into what you might call the perfect storm, if you'd excuse the pun.
And so is it because of the warm ocean that it went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 so quickly? And if so, can you sort of explain, in a very basic way, please, some of the science behind that?
Yeah, so it's definitely part of the reason. I couldn't tell you conclusively what the exact reasons are because it's still kind of happening. But essentially, hurricanes develop when the ocean is super warm. So I think it's around 26.5 degrees Celsius, where if my GCSE geography serves me well. But basically, that means that you have loads of heat available at the surface of the ocean, which can drive really strong evaporation and huge amounts of energy in the atmosphere is what basically causes these things to develop, and then they start to intensify. So having a hotter ocean means there's more energy available to kind of drive that process, and it means that these sorts of storms can become stronger, more intense, and they can become more destructive.
And I know there's sort of complete scientific consensus that storms of this intensity will happen more often than they would otherwise without climate change. Is there any kind of consensus in terms of actually how often they will happen? Is this, you say this is an unusual storm, but will this become the norm? Or people living in somewhere like Florida have to expect that they might need to evacuate their homes once a year, for example?
Yeah, like you say, the science has been a little bit less clear about the impact of climate change on storms than with other extreme events, for example. But it is thought that climate change is making the intensity of these storms much greater. So, for example, Helene, which was very recent, was shown to be made about 2.5 times more likely because of climate change, and it increased the amount of rain that fell by around 1/10, and it increased the wind speed by around 1/10. So climate change is fueling more intense hurricanes. It's hard to say really conclusively how many more times a year this might start to happen because, the hurricane season is different every single year. And this particular season in the Gulf of Mexico has been quite unusual, but it's almost certain that we're going to see more of this stuff in the future. Of course, that's going to depend on human action. So the more we reduce emissions, the lower the temperatures rise, the less of these kinds of extremes we're going to see accelerating.
Presumably the authorities in Florida have done the right thing, I imagine, by telling 6 million people to evacuate their homes. What else should governments be doing? Obviously, in regions which are vulnerable to hurricanes, I'll put on hold a moment where those might be. But in regions where hurricanes are likely, are possible, and could be strong, what should governments be doing other than sort of keeping an eye out and telling people to leave their homes when it's on its way?
Well, that's a really big part of it, right? Having the knowledge and the information available and the preparedness is a really big way to avoid the kind of catastrophic and devastating deaths and destruction that can result from these sorts of storms. Apart from obviously making sure that the problem is not being worsened, i.e. we need to reduce emissions, we need to curb the effects of climate change to stop these sorts of things happening. Storms are going to happen regardless of what we do about climate change. But having our eyes fully open, having all of that information available, having a really clear action plan to put into place when these sorts of things are detected in advance, that's also really, really important. And that's what all of the nations that are affected by these sorts of storms regularly do have in place. But this is just a broader point about adapting to the consequences of extreme weather events. We have to have a plan to adapt to them. We have to have a plan to react to them when they do happen, and be conscious, building huge developments right on the seafront in places that are really prone to flooding or storms seems like a silly idea. And rethinking the way that you plan towns and cities so that people, especially the most vulnerable people who are often the most neglected in these scenarios, are not put at risk unnecessarily. So it's a much more holistic problem or solution to the problem is required, and certainly one that goes well beyond the realms of climate science.
And in terms of who needs to be worried about hurricanes, where is vulnerable to hurricanes and why? I mean, you mentioned sort of warm water. Do you have to be next to a body of warm water to be at risk of a hurricane?
The reason that the Gulf of Mexico gets so many, and places like Florida are often in the track of hurricanes, or the Caribbean, for example, is because, first of all, you have that warm ocean water. You're not going to get a hurricane off the coast of Norway just because the water's not warm enough. But you also have the general direction of the wind. So you have this storm track, which is basically a pathway that most storms follow in the Northern Hemisphere. And that happens to go across the Gulf of Mexico, happens to go all the way over the Atlantic. And what sometimes starts as a hurricane, we end up getting as a kind of nasty storm with loads of rain in the UK. But that's the kind of general trajectory, and this often happens. So you can predict the sorts of places that are going to be much more affected by these sorts of storms. But generally speaking, the sort of extreme events that we see, whether that's a typhoon or a monsoon or a hurricane, all of these are becoming more intense and having more profound impacts because of climate change, because of the way that the heating of the atmosphere causes the atmosphere to hold on to more water. All of this is happening. So lots of places are more vulnerable to climate change, intensifying the water cycle, and it's not necessarily just about hurricanes.
Presumably, would I be correct in sort of thinking that the really toxic combination is if you're sort of in a hurricane-prone area and you're a poor country? Because I'm guessing, this is going to be very traumatic for all of those who live in Florida, who live sort of in the path of this hurricane. But America is rich enough to kind of make this work, to kind of deal with a hurricane like this arriving. Is it the case that sort of if it's those poor countries that are subject to extreme weather events like this that we really need to be worried about?
It's always the case that the most vulnerable people in society and between nations are always the ones that are worst affected, because you have fewer resources available to manage that response, to evacuate and to rebuild afterwards. And I mean, just think about Katrina, right? Like, those were the most underserved communities that were kind of neglected, and that was within the US. So it's vulnerable people within nations as well as vulnerable nations themselves. And it's about the resources that governments are willing to put into those communities. So it's not just a rich nations versus poor nations thing, but generally speaking, the most underserved communities are always the ones that bear the brunt of the costs.
Ella Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Always very insightful and clarifying having you on. The Renters' Rights Bill has today been introduced into Parliament for its second reading. The long-awaited bill would end no-fault evictions, giving all tenants more secure long-term contracts. It will also increase fines for landlords for renting out dangerous flats and provide tenants with more rights to keep pets. However, it will do little to protect renters from rent hikes. Housing Secretary Angela Rayner said this in the Commons today.
We value the contribution made by responsible landlords who provide quality homes to their tenants. But we say again, unscrupulous landlords who tarnish the reputation of the whole, who seek to exploit or to discriminate against tenants, have no place in this sector. This government was elected with a mandate to deliver change. This bill is the first of many where this government will honour our promise to the people. After 5 years of the last government who failed to legislate for renters' rights, we are bringing forward our bill within the first 100 days in office, a measure that will change the lives of millions of people. So for them and future generations, I commend this bill to the House.
It is good. This bill is going through so quickly. Getting rid of no-fault evictions will be a real win for renters. As I say, though, the big sort of gap here is in terms of rent regulation. And the papers this morning had two very different perspectives on the rental reform bill, or the Renters' Rights Bill. In the Times, Rachel Earwaker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation argued the bill needs to protect tenants from rent increases. She also points out that the bill in its current form only regulates rent increases via a complicated tribunal process. And she suggests that instead annual rent increases should be capped at whichever is lower, inflation or earnings growth. One perspective there. A very different perspective came from Kemi Badenoch in what looked like a last gasp attempt to rescue her Tory leadership campaign, and in fact seems to potentially have done that. She railed against the bill in the Telegraph, arguing the Renters' Rights Bill is a disaster for young people and will only make things worse for tenants. She wrote this: their bill, so Labour's bill, will reduce the supply of rental homes, drive up rents and deter the building of new homes for hard-pressed young people. Landlords don't actually build homes. It's time to tell the truth about our property market. Landlords provide a vital service. The private rented sector is vital for many who can't yet afford a mortgage, for young people and for those who need to move for work. The overwhelming majority of landlords are people who care for their tenants and ask only that their property be respected and a fair rent is paid. Respect for property rights is not just an abstract principle, it underpins confidence in our economy and legal system. There are lots of countries where there's lots of faith in their legal system and their system of property rights, where they have regulation which is a lot more onerous than the one that Labour is proposing here. Just look at Germany, for example, Austria. Dalia, are you welcoming the Renters' Rights Bill?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously better than nothing. It's better than what the Conservatives did with housing rights, which was very little. I do agree with the piece don't quite remember her name, but the person from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who makes the very obvious point that if you're going to introduce a policy that regulates rent increases rather than doing it before the rent increase, by capping how much a rent can increase by, like they have in Berlin, for example, doing it by this kind of retroactive tribunal process is far more costly, it's far more onerous, and the purpose of it is to ultimately disincentivize renters from exercising their rights, because, most renters are time poor, are cash poor, and are not really going to have the mental headspace or maybe even the legal expertise to unless they have the support of a renters union like Acorn or London, or part of London Renters Union. If you are in London, it will be very difficult to go through this process. And it's a perfect example of this kind of irritating third wayism, where you actually introduce a far more costly and complicated system in order to give a right by name, but not in practice, because you're scared to be seen as socialist, or because it just doesn't align with the economic incentives and interests and political interests of the government or of powerful people. And so there are these clear ways in which this bill could have really dramatically improved the lives of all renters, such as by giving the stability that a cap on rent increases has. Because ultimately, what the rent caps do in a place like Berlin is it means that you don't have to own a home in order to have stable housing. And at the moment, there is this sense of in Britain, this real pitting against of home ownership versus renting. And it's the question is, should we make it easier to rent, or should we make it easier for people to buy homes? And it's ultimately the thing that people want is affordable housing that gives them autonomy over their lives, that if they want to stay in that home for 10, 15, 20 years, they can, and they can afford to do so, and they're not going to be evicted by a landlord for no reason. Or even for a legitimate reason. It's this is my home. You can't just decide that your relative wants to come in and live here, and therefore I have to abandon all the roots that I've put down here. Or if you're someone that has to be mobile, that you can have the option to, live in a decent place and then move when you want to another place. That's actually like the fundamental thing that people want. And that's what, something like a rent cap does, because you can say, okay, it's not just that I can afford to be in this place now. I know that I will probably be able to afford to be in this place as long as I want to. And that kind of rootedness in place is conducive to so many other like well-being impacts and so many other things that make people's lives easier. It's a really important part of being a person in society and for people's well-being. And it's increasingly reserved for the very, very few. And of course, it goes without saying that Kemi Badenoch saying that, landlords provide housing is completely farcical. Landlords do not provide housing. They gatekeep housing. Because if landlords actually did provide housing, if they actually were not, primarily a profit-making, asset-based enterprise where for a landlord, if there's no reason that you take on a buy-to-let property unless it's to make money off it. You don't take on a buy-to-let property or buy a buy-to-let property out of the goodness of your heart because you just want to house people. You do it because you have an asset and you want to have the highest return on that asset possible. So there's no reason why a landlord would not do anything other than spend the absolute bare minimum on their tenants and on their housing, because that's the reason that they became a landlord to begin with. So in fact, landlords actually stand in the way between us and good housing, between us and available housing. They are the exact opposite of housing providers. They are housing gatekeepers. And it's unfortunate that we're in a situation, despite living in an alleged social democracy where essential services, essential rights, of which housing is one, is supposed to be heavily regulated and universal and provided for everyone. It's unfortunate that in our dual party system, both parties feel like they need to preface everything by being complete sycophants to landlordism and acting like landlords do what they do because they're just really passionate about housing people. No, they do what they do because housing is one of the most secure and lucrative assets that you can get in this economy, and they want to make money off of other people's need to live in homes. And that's the truth of it. And I don't understand how we abandoned totally this idea of like social housing, this idea of housing as some kind of good that we're all entitled to something where we can't even talk about housing apparently in, the political establishment without first congratulating landlords on their amazing job, that they do of, painting over damp every few years when their new tenants move in.
They're providing a service by painting over that damp every few years when new tenants move in, don't you know? Dalia, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.